Amen. So you're there in Ezekiel chapter 40, and the last two chapters that we've done, we were getting into this battle of Gog and Magog. I was showing, obviously, how this applied during the time before they had built the walls and everything around Jerusalem, and probably while they were building the temple and everything. This passage here, there's a lot of different thought processes as far as what this is talking about, but this is clearly a vision about a temple, right? And so I'm going to give you my thought process on this, but if you're to look at maybe a lot of what people would say about this temple is that you'd have a lot of people that would say that this is a physical thing that's representing the spiritual, meaning that there's a lot of spiritual application to the New Testament, to the Lord Jesus Christ, and to what he's going to do, and just in general what the temple pictures and all of that. And I 100% agree with that, but I also do believe that this is talking about an actual physical temple. Now, what the dispensationalists will say, the Zionists out there, that they will say that this temple is actually something that is to be built in the future, like our future, meaning that this is going to be a temple that's going to be built, and during the millennial reign, the Jews and everybody that gets saved and everything are going to be basically using this temple. And I completely disagree with that. And so, and the big reason that I disagree with that is because throughout all these chapters, what you'll see is animal sacrifices that are being done. And that is completely blasphemous when it comes to the fact that Jesus is the one sacrifice for all. Now, let's get into this. So first of all, where are we at, in the time frame here, right? Context matters when it comes to this. If this was written after the temple was already built, I could be like, okay, what do we, this would be some kind of future application, right, or something like that. But this is clearly after the Solomon's temple has been destroyed and before the new temple that they were going to build is built. So it doesn't, I don't think, take that much to really, a real stretch here to think that this is talking about instructions for a temple that needs to be rebuilt since the last one just got destroyed. So notice what it says here in verse 1. It says, "In the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was smitten, in the selfsame day, the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither." So we are 25 years into the 70-year captivity. Remember, what year was the temple destroyed within that 70-year captivity? The 11th year. So what's 11 plus 14? 25, right? And actually, this vision is given to Ezekiel the exact day, to the day when the city was destroyed and the temple was burned and everything was taken out, right? So we are 25 years into the captivity. So we're not even halfway through the captivity, and Ezekiel is getting this vision about this temple. And look what it says here in verse 2. It says, in the visions of God brought he me into the land of Israel. Okay, so where is he at? This isn't like he's in heaven seeing a temple. Okay, so let's kind of nix that. So he's being brought in this vision in the land of Israel, and set me upon a very high mountain, by which was as the frame of a city on the south. And he brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass. So this could very well be an angel. This could be a saint. Like obviously, when you're in Revelation, sometimes the angels there are actually believers. But anyway, there's a man, appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand, and a measuring reed. And he stood in the gate. And the man said unto me, Son of man, behold with thine eyes, and hear with thine ears, and set thine heart upon all that I shall show thee, for to the intent that I might show them unto thee art thou brought hither. Declare all that thou seest to the house of Israel. So he's basically saying, I'm going to show you all this. And what's the line of flax and the measuring reed? Okay, well, a line of flax is used to measure. It's like a tape measure. So if you think about like a tape measure that you use to maybe like measure people for like their measurements on like an outfit, right? It's something that you can go around things. It's not rigid. Okay, so line of flax is something, it's kind of like rope, if you will. But then a measuring reed is like a measuring stick. So essentially you have a measuring tape and you have a measuring stick, and as you could tell if you were listening as this chapter is being read, there's a lot of measurements that are being brought forward. And so these chapters, I believe, are instructions for the building of the temple that had been destroyed. Okay, so basically the temple's destroyed, the city's destroyed, and these are instructions for that. We see here in verse 5 that it's going to give us the dimensions of this reed. So it's going to tell us how long is this reed that they're using. It says in verse 5 here, it says, "Behold, a wall on the outside of the house round about, in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long, by the cubit and an handbreadth. So he measured the breadth of the building, 1 reed, and the height, 1 reed." Now, before we get into the measurements of this whole thing, I'm actually going to get into kind of preface this whole series, if you will, that we go on from chapter 40 to chapter 48 here, of giving you why people would say this can't be talking about the temple that was going to be built after 70 AD, or I'm sorry, after the 70-year captivity. But first of all, let's get this. What is this reed? 6 cubits long. Now, a cubit is about 18 inches, but this isn't a typical cubit that we're talking about here. This is what they call a long cubit, okay? And so it says, by the cubit and an handbreadth. Okay, so what is a cubit? A cubit is from elbow to fingertip, okay? So this is why I love the U.S. units of measurements, or English units, because it's like a foot, all these different things. It's based off someone's footprint, because that's biblical, that's why. This metric system, they can go pound salt with that. I understand it's easier to convert, but I don't care. I think our unit system is more biblical, so whatever, who cares? But basically, the measurement system in the Bible is basically like off body parts, right? So a cubit is from your elbow to your fingertip, about 18 inches. Okay, mine's actually 18 inches. Like when I measured this one time, because apparently that's what I do with my free time. But so a handbreadth, you can imagine, is the breadth of your hand. Now, I measured this too, and you can look this up as far as what they say it is. It's between 3 and 4 inches. If you don't count my thumb, it's 4 inches. It's 3 inches. If you count my thumb, it's 4 inches. So that means that this is between 21 inches and 22 inches, right? So if you have 18 inches as a cubit, you add a handbreadth in there, 3 inches to 4 inches, it's 21 inches to 22 inches. So you're dealing with one of these reeds, which is 6 cubits long, and you use that measurement of 21 to 22 inches, you're dealing with about 10 and a half feet to 11 feet. Okay, so that's what a reed is. And I'm not going to get too caught up with the dimensions here, because I'm not really getting into all the numbers and trying to figure out, why are these numbers the way they are. Because really, in the end, whatever the cubit is, it is what it is, right? So if you take it as a cubit is 18 inches, and you just go with that, the dimensions are going to still be, it's going to be, it may not be the exact size, but it's the ratio of everything is going to still be the same, okay? So you have this 10.5 foot to 11 foot, basically reed that you're dealing with here. Now, there are a couple things that people will say, this cannot be the temple that was in Jesus' day. And they'll go to something like, go to Ezekiel 42. Let me just show you this. Ezekiel 42, it gives these dimensions of basically the extent of this area around the sanctuary. Now, the sanctuary, the outer court, actually, Brother David, do you mind passing these out? I'll keep one for myself. But raise a hand if you'd like. representation of this outer court and stuff. Now, I just found this online, so don't look at this as gospel truth, okay, as far as this exactly representing it. But I do think it's good. I'm a visual person, so when we're talking about these dimensions and we're talking about these things, it's nice to see a picture of how this is represented, okay? But if you were to look at this picture here, this is a square, and this square here is 500 cubits by 500 cubits, okay? Now, if you were to look at a 500 cubits by 500 cubits, about 750 feet by 750 feet if you take a cubit of 18 inches, okay? So an easy way to figure out a cubit to feet is just multiply it by 1.5. So just take half of it and add it to 1, or add it to whatever it is, okay? So if it's 500 cubits, half of, anyway, you get the point. So, we'll be getting into that a little bit more there, but looking at Ezekiel 42, it talks about this area. So know this is that this is 500 cubits by 500 cubits, and but then it talks about this area that's outside of that, okay, meaning that kind of like encompassing this area. It says, now when he had made an end of measuring, so you're in Ezekiel 42 and verse 15, measuring the inner house, he brought me forth toward the gate whose prospect is toward the east, and measured it round about. He measured the east side with the measuring reed, 500 reeds with the measuring reed round about. He measured the north side, 500 reeds with the measuring reed round about. He measured the south side, 500 reeds with the measuring reed. And he turned about to the west side and measured 500 reeds with the measuring reed. He measured it by the four sides. It had a wall round about 500 reeds long and 500 reeds broad to make a separation between the sanctuary and the profane place. Now, what you'll see actually when we go through this is that there's actually a bigger area, okay, outside of that, that's like 25,000 cubits that's outside of this, okay? So anyway, it's basically like you have the sanctuary, which is this area right here, right? This whole thing is going to be called like the sanctuary area. We have the outer court, inner court. You have the house of the Lord there, the temple. And outside of that, you have this 500 reeds, which is about, okay, if you take the 10.5 feet, it's basically 5,250 feet by 5,250 feet. If you take, the 11 feet, then it's more like 5,500 feet by 5,500 feet, which is basically about a square mile. Okay, so because 5,280 feet is a mile. Okay, so you're in that range of like a square mile is this area. And they'll say, well, but there's not like this, there wasn't this wall around that whole area. If you take this dimensions right here, and you say, well, what about the Temple Mount and all that stuff? It's like, well, one, we're taking history as far as where everything's at and all of that. Know this is that the temple was completely destroyed. Not one stone was left upon another. And so, but this would fit on the Temple Mount. Okay, this would fit on the Temple Mount. Okay, meaning that it's 750 feet by 750 feet. The Temple Mount itself is 1,500 feet by 1,000 feet, somewhere around there. Okay, so it's not like this whole thing right here wouldn't fit on there. It's just basically stating that there's going to be this other wall that's going to be outside of that. Then there's this holy district where there's another wall that's around that. And then there's what is called the profane place outside of that. So, that being said, when it comes to this, you say, well, we don't have history that's telling us about these areas being broken up like that or these dimensions and all of that. What I want to state to you is that these are instructions, but it doesn't mean that they actually did it this way. This does not say that it shall be this way. Actually, what you'll see is that there is an if statement here dealing with actually the form of all of this stuff. Go to Ezekiel chapter 43. Let me show you this. Is that if this wasn't built this way, it doesn't negate this being instructions that should have been this way. This is not something that would be out of the norm when it comes to Israel and the fact that they don't follow things to the letter of the law. They don't actually do what they're told to do half the time. the Feast of Tabernacles was not kept correctly since the days of Joshua till you got to Ezra or Nehemiah. And there's times where they weren't doing things the way they should be done. Or think about this. How many years were they in captivity for? 70 years. You know how that number came to be? Because that was the number of Sabbath years that they did not keep. You know how many years it takes to mess that up? 490. Because you need 490 years in order to miss a Sabbath, to miss 70 Sabbaths. Okay, so for 490 years, maybe not consecutively, but either way, they missed these Sabbath days, and they weren't doing that correctly. How about when they went into the Promised Land? Did they go into the Promised Land? Did it follow exactly the way God wanted it to happen? No, it didn't. Because they were supposed to completely annihilate everybody that breathed, everything that was in there, and it was supposed to be everybody was completely gone. It was just Israel that's in there. Is that what happened? Nope, that's not what happened. And there were people that were of the land that lived there unto the day of, Simon the Canaanite is one of the 12 apostles. So, it wouldn't be shocking if they didn't follow these instructions to the T. But I think it's also interesting when you read what it says here. After it gives the instructions of, this chapter is more so dealing with the courts before you get to the temple in chapter 41, and you get to other information that's going down the line here. But chapter 43 and verse 10 here, it says, "Thou son of man, show the house to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern." Notice in verse 11 here. "And if they be ashamed of all that they have done, show them the form of the house and the fashion thereof." Notice that if statement there. If they be ashamed of all that they have done, show them the form of the house and the fashion thereof, and the goings out thereof, and the comings in thereof, and all the forms thereof, and all the ordinances thereof. Now, this isn't just talking about the house itself, because there's some ordinances that are given here that are kind of a little different, or maybe a little unique compared to what it was in Exodus. And we'll get into that as we go down the line here when we go through these chapters. But it says, "And all the forms thereof, and all the laws thereof, and write it in their sight, that they may keep the whole form thereof, and all the ordinances thereof, and do them. This is the law of the house upon the top of the mountain. The whole limit thereof round about shall be most holy. Behold, this is the law of the house." So notice that big if there, though. Notice that big if, that if they be ashamed of all that they have done. So that kind of puts a question mark as whether they did perform of the whole form thereof. Isn't that an interesting phrase there, that they may keep the whole form thereof? Meaning that they may not be maybe they did it partially. Maybe it was a little bit of this, okay? But this was what God was intending for them to do. Go to Zechariah chapter 6 and verse 9. We know, obviously, I think I proved this when we were going through Gog and Magog and all that Zechariah is at the time where they're building the temple, right? So the temple was halted in its work, and then Darius the king, the Persian, not the Mede, Darius the king of Persia came in and then had them start up the work again. Okay, so Cyrus the Persian gives the decree to go build the temple, gives them all the materials, all that stuff, and then after Cyrus, there's other kings that come down the line, and there's enemies that stop them. Darius comes in and starts the work again, and Zechariah is at that time. Now, Zechariah chapter 6 and verse, let's just look down at verse 15, just for sake of time, because this is a longer chapter, and I'm really trying to just preface this with this. You can read this in your time, but you're in the wilderness. They failed, they failed everywhere when it came to what they were supposed to do, but Christ doesn't fail. And so, in verse 15 here, it says, "And they that are far off shall come and build in the temple of the Lord, and ye shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you, and this shall come to pass if you will diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God." I think there's some interesting if statements there when it comes to the building of the temple, specifically in Ezekiel, which is the passage that we're in, and the fact of the idea of the form of it. And the idea of them being ashamed or them keeping the commandments and doing that. And, it wouldn't shock me if because they weren't actually ashamed like they should have been or they weren't doing what they should be doing. And you say, well, but when they came back, they were just on board and they were ready to go, except for the fact that Haggai's rebuking them, saying, is it not time to build the house of the Lord? You're over here in sealed houses. So Malachi would kind of disprove that too. When you think about what's said in Malachi about them and how they're bringing stuff that's detestable to the Lord and all this. So anyway, go to Hebrews chapter 10. And the biggest thing with this, okay, I'm definitely on the side of people saying like, hey, this is a spiritual, like a lot of this is representing the New Testament. It's representing what Christ is going to do. It's representing the New Testament believer. Got it, yes. But I definitely think there's a physical application here, whether it's fully realized or not. And I don't know if we'll ever know because we're basing any information as far as the temple on history. And you got to base it off history that goes all the way back to the 1st century because it was destroyed in 70 AD. Okay, so there's a lot of information there that we don't know. But I don't think it has to be. If you found history and you're like, hey, the dimensions are a little different here, or they didn't have this portion here, it'd be like, yeah, I mean, that kind of would fit with what's stated here, though. It wouldn't shock me. But here's why this cannot be some future temple in the millennial reign. And you'll see that in the end of this chapter here, it's talking about these tables that are where they kill these sacrifices, right? They're killing all these sacrifices. And then you'll see this throughout throughout the book of the rest of the book of Ezekiel of them actually killing animals and having animal sacrifices. That makes a lot of sense if you're talking about the temple that they build after the captivity. Yeah, 100%. They're sacrificing up to the time of Christ. But if this is something like that's going to happen in our future, so you're telling me they're going to bring back animal sacrifices, and these dispensationalists will say, I just happen to believe the Bible. It's like, except for the fact that the timeline of this is 25 years into the captivity of Israel and the Babylonian captivity. This is not some vision that is given after that or after the time of Christ, right? What you will not find in the New Testament is where God is telling them to build a temple and do sacrifices. You will not find that. What you will find is what Hebrews chapter 10 here, with what it says in verse 5. And I would love to go on a tour de force right now on all the verses on the fact that the Old Testament has been done away with and abolished. But let's just stick with this right here. It says in verse 5, it says, wherefore, when he cometh into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body hast thou prepared me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast had no pleasure. But he will in the future. Yeah, that makes sense. Then said I, lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. Above, when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin, thou wouldest not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. The first has to be taken away, or you have to say the New Testament has not been established. But by the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest standing daily, ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God from henceforth, expecting till his enemies be made his footstool. And for by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. Period. The New Testament is the everlasting covenant. As the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 20, it says, now the God of peace that brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting covenant, make you perfect in every good work, to do his will, working in you that which is well-pleasing in his sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. He hath an unchangeable priesthood. To say that the Levites are going to start coming in again, you're going from the Levitical priesthood to the priesthood, which is after the order of Melchizedek, Jesus Christ being the high priest, and you're going to go back to the Levitical priesthood? You're going to go back to these animal sacrifices, which God did not have pleasure in? Like, it's insanity. So, if someone says, hey, this is all spiritual, like this is all just to be spiritualized, okay, I disagree. I think that any type of passage in the Old Testament's got a physical application to it on top of the spiritual. But I reject the idea of this being some future temple where they're actually doing animal sacrifice. Now, will the Antichrist take this? Yeah, that's possible, right? Will the Antichrist take Ezekiel 9, where it talks about putting a mark on your forehead and be safe from the judgment of God? Probably, right? You can see how the Antichrist would be like, well, it says here, and that to build this temple, and I mean, this is what to come, and these animal sacrifices, and everybody's just like, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So I just wanted to put this preface on here, that I do not believe that this is instructions for some future temple. And you say, and here's the thing with this, is that there's language in here about perpetuity when it comes to this, like this foreverness to it. What's very interesting about that is that in the new heaven, new earth, there is no temple. It explicitly says there's no temple, and that the Lord our God, that the Lord and the Lamb are the temple. So this cannot be talking about some millennial temple. And here's why it speaks in like this perpetuity, is because the Old Testament is a forever testament as long as they keep it. It's like if we had rent here for forever, right? It was just on there. It had the infinity sign on there, right? But you have to keep paying the rent or that infinity sign doesn't matter. Because if I stop paying rent, the landlord doesn't have to keep his deal. He doesn't have to keep the covenant. It's broken. And finding fault with them is what the Bible says when it comes to the Old Testament as far as why it was disannulled, why it was abolished. It wasn't because God didn't keep his end of the deal. It's because they didn't. Okay, so anyway, let's get into the dimensions here. Okay, so I wanted to preface that. Clearly, this is not talking about some millennial temple, millennial reign temple. Doesn't make any sense. Sacrifices, blasphemous. Jesus Christ is the one and only true sacrifice for our sins. And obviously, all those sacrifices beforehand pictured it. Now, when we're talking about this, I found this online, so I'm sure it's not perfect here, but it gives you an idea. That north is up, right? So this is your south gate, your north gate, your east gate. And what you're going to find here is that the way that the chapter here works is you're starting in from the east gate, and you're working your way in. Okay, so this chapter is going to cover everything up to the inner court and to the porch of the temple. Okay, so, but then, or not everything, but it's basically coming from the outside of the outer court wall, in through the gate, up to the gates of the inner court, and into the inner court. And then chapter 41, we're going to get into actual temple dimensions and stuff like that. Okay, so there is kind of a nice fluid movement here as far as these dimensions go. But what you'll see here as we go through here is that a lot of this chapter, from verse 6 to verse 16, we're really talking about this gate right here. So there's a lot of information about that gate. And then it's going to talk about the outer court a little bit, and then it's going to talk about, the north and south gate. But the north and south gate are the same. So what you'll see is this stuff is being repeated, just not as much detail. But it's nice because there's some things where you're trying to figure out like these dimensions as far as how they work. And it's simplified when you're talking about these two gates, and they're the same, so that applies. Okay. And so you're going to have basically, this is 500 cubits by 500 cubits. You have 50 cubits long for this gate, 100 cubits between these two gates, You have another 50 cubits here, and then this court right here is 100 cubits by 100 cubits. So think about the math there, right? 50, 50, 50, 50, 200, 100, 100, 200. So that's 400, and then 100 in the middle, 500. So it just kind of on a bird's eye view, that's what we're dealing with here. And that's about 750 feet, maybe 800 and some feet, if you're looking at the cubit in a handbreadth, the longer cubit. But I think this helps to really understand, okay, when we're looking at these verses here, we're just talking about this area right here. Okay, so, because I think it's easy to, like, you hear chambers and you're like, where's this at? You know? Because there's chambers within this little gate area here, and there's chambers around here, and there's chambers that are here, right? And there's a lot of chambers. So I think it just helps to see it visually. And so let's read this and kind of know that we're on the east gate there. Okay, it says, verse 6, Then came he unto the gate which looketh toward the east, and went up the stairs thereof, and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad, and the other threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad. Okay, threshold is like where you walk in, kind of like, you think about like a threshold of a house where you have like a little area where you're walking in, kind of like a porch area. And so 1 reed is what, 6 cubits, or we saw was about 11 feet. Okay, so when you look at this gate here, there's like a little area when you walk in of a threshold on the front end and on the back end of 11 feet. Okay, so it says, And every little chamber was 1 reed long and 1 reed broad. And between the little chambers were 5 cubits. Now in here, you're going to see that there's 3 chambers on each side. These are like, what a lot of people think these are like the guard chambers. Like if you're at a gate, you have these guards that are there, okay? But basically there's these 3 chambers on each side, and then there's like a space between them. Okay, so you have like a chamber, space, space, and so there's 6 in each one of these gates. This is going to be the same up here. So when you look at the gates that are on the outside, they're the same as the gates that are on the inner court. Okay, so it says here in verse 8, it says, And he measured also the porch of the gate within 1 reed. It says, Then measured he the porch of the gate 8 cubits, and the post thereof 2 cubits, and the porch of the gate was inward. And I think what it's basically showing you here is that all this stuff is inside here. Okay, so when it's talking about being inward, is like, hey, this stuff is happening. Like you have the wall that's around it, but then all this stuff in these chambers around there are inside the outer court, if you will. It says in verse 10 there, it says, In the little chambers of the gate eastward were 3 on this side and 3 on that side. Okay, so 3 on that portion, 3 on that portion, right? So on this case, it's north and south as you're walking in. It says, And he measured the breadth of the entry of the gate 10 cubits, and the length of the gate 13 cubits. So I think what you're dealing with here is the breadth of the gate. So if you're like walking in here, the gate, how wide the gate is 10 cubits. So just, if you're dealing with a normal cubit, that's 15 feet, right? 13 cubits, you're dealing with like 20 feet. So or somewhere around there. That's how high this gate is. It says in verse 12, The space also before the little chambers was 1 cubit on this side, and the space was 1 cubit on that side. And the little chambers were 6 cubits on this side and 6 cubits on that side. He measured then the gate from the roof of one little chamber to the roof of another. The breadth was 25 cubits, door against door. Now, this is kind of confusing the way this is written, but when you look at all the other gates, it states that these things are 25 cubits by 50 cubits. So basically, from the roof of this little chamber right here to this little chamber over here is 25 cubits. Okay? And so when you're reading that, you're kind of like from the door to door. I'm like, okay, where's the door at? You know, and like I'm like, is it the front of it? Is it in between them? You know, all that stuff. But then when you look at the other measurements, it's like, no, it's front. It's the roof, the whole roof of the chamber from the back end of it to the other side is 25 cubits. So that's why these are all 50 by 25. So you're dealing with a rectangle essentially. And then it says in verse 14, he made also posts of 80 cubits, and even unto the post of the court round about the gate. Now, 80 cubits, what's that? So 60 cubits, right? 80. So a score is 20. 3 of those, 60. And if you're using a cubit, like typical cubit, then that's 90 feet. Okay, so these are tall. Okay, so when you're dealing with this, I think what you're probably dealing with here is that these chambers go up that high, and then there's a space, and then there's another chamber that goes up. And what you're going to see is that there's these pillars, and then there's these arches that connect the pillars. Okay, that kind of connects this all together. You've probably all seen, how this like Roman buildings, right, where you have these big concrete pillars, and then you have like a big stone that's connecting the pillars and all that stuff. So you can kind of visualize what's going on here as far as what this is kind of. It's this big, tall structure, and there's a gate there, and then there's a wall that goes around this whole area. So you have to go through one of these gates to get in. So it says here, 80 cubits, and it says in verse 15, and from the face of the gate of the entrance unto the face of the porch of the inner gate were 50 cubits. So this is where it's kind of like you're reading there like, where is this taken from? But that's basically saying from the gate to the inner porch, right? There's a porch that's going into this where you're kind of coming out of it, and that's 50 cubits. So 50 cubits is the length, 25 cubits is the width. Like I said, when you're reading the other gates, it's just like, yeah, this makes sense. Like it kind of simplifies it, and you know that all in all, that's the dimensions of this thing. It says in verse 16, it says, there were narrow windows to the little chambers, to their posts within the gate round about, and likewise to the arches. And windows were round about inward, and upon each post were palm trees. So all these posts have palm trees basically engraved in them or put on them or something like that. But then there's like these little narrow windows. So I just kind of think of like a long, narrow window, that you can see out of or whatever that are on these chambers. So when you read this, you're just kind of like, what did I just read? Okay. But essentially, you're just dealing with this area right here. This gate right here. And so this gate kind of makes up these chambers, and it's got these big pillars, and there's these arches that are connecting those things. And there's basically an entrance where the gate is. There's steps that go up to it. There's 7 steps that go up. And so when you are looking at this thing, you're starting down low, and you have 7 steps going up into this outer court. Then you're going to have 8 steps that go up into the inner court, and then you're going to have steps that are going up into the temple. Okay, so it's kind of working your way up to get to the temple. Okay. Look, verse 17 here, we see the outer court. And in verse 17, it says, then brought he me into the outer court. So now you can imagine he's being brought into these areas. So imagine you're Ezekiel, and he's seeing this vision. He's going through this east gate, and he's like being told all these dimensions, and then he's coming through that east gate, and now he's in the outer court, right? And it says, and lo, there were chambers and pavement made for the court round about. 30 chambers were upon the pavement, and the pavement by the side of the gates, over against the length of the gates, was the lower pavement. Then he measured the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate unto the forefront of the inner court without, and 100 cubits eastward and northward. Now, that's where you get to, like, from gate to gate here is 100 cubits, okay? But basically, this is lower pavement, which makes sense. You're stepping up to it, and then you're going to step up into the into the inner court. So this is the lower pavement. And so there's 30 chambers, okay, so that are going around this. So when you look at your thing there, you see these kind of boxes there. I didn't make this, so I'm not the one that put kitchen really big on there. Like, I'm a big fat fatty that really needs to know where the kitchen's at in this thing, okay? I don't know why that's like what they really wanted to mark on this thing, okay? But you're like, that's clearly your drawing. But you know, there's all these chambers that are over there, okay? So, but you can kind of see the way it's shown on here is that there's 30 chambers, and there's 6 areas, you know, between the gates. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you'd have 5 chambers in each area, which would give you 30. Okay, so I'm just hoping that this visual helps you when you're reading this. Like, okay, that's what those chambers are. You have these chambers that are on each side of you as you're going through the gate. But then when you get to the outer court, there's these chambers that are making the outline of that whole outer court. Okay. So go to verse 20 here, and really these next a lot of this, like the from verse 20 to verse 27 here, we're dealing with the north gate of the outer court and the south gate of the outer court, and this is where it kind of simplifies these dimensions for us to where we really can grasp. Okay, yeah, that's what this is looking like, but also that they're the same. Okay, when east gate, north gate, south gate, they're the same. As far as dimensions and everything that's going on. Verse 20 here, it says, in the gate of the outward court that looked toward the north, he measured the length thereof and the breadth thereof, and the little chambers thereof were 3 on this side and 3 on that side, and the posts thereof and the arches thereof were after the measure of the first gate. The length thereof was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. So you can just see it very clearly just stated, okay? This whole structure here is 50 by 25. It says, and their windows and their arches and their palm trees were after the measure of the gate that looketh toward the east, and they went up unto it by 7 steps, and the arches thereof were before them. And the gate of the inner court was over against the gate of the north, and toward the east, and he measured from gate to gate 100 cubits. Okay, so you'll see that that's what's going on there, and you'll see that the inner court gates are the same dimensions. So yeah, it all fits when you look at later on when it says it's 500 cubits by 500 cubits. I mean, all these dimensions fit perfectly. You have 50, 100, 50, 150, 150. Gives you 500. And so you kind of know all the maths. You know, the math works. And so the south gate, same thing. Look at verse 24 here. If you want me to go slower, I can. I'm just kidding. No one wants me to go slower on this. But, you know, this is obviously you're dealing with all these dimensions and stuff, but I think it's cool to visualize this. And here's the thing, you know, this could very well be what the temple looked like to a certain extent when Jesus was here. You know, when Jesus was here on the earth and what that temple looked like. I think it's interesting. Verse 24 there, it says, after that he brought me toward the south, and behold a gate toward the south, and he measured the posts thereof and the arches thereof according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and the arches thereof round about like those windows. The length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And there were 7 steps to go up to it, and the arches thereof were before them. And it had palm trees, one on this side and another on that side, upon the posts thereof. And there was a gate in the inner court toward the south, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. So you can see that it's all symmetrical, right? All this is, and you notice you never see a west gate. Okay, so there's no gate over here. This is where the temple's at, and so this is kind of like the back end of everything. Okay, so then in verse 28 here we get into the inner court, and so what we'll see. And I know I'm kind of already telling you what it is, but I think that it helps if you already kind of know what we're dealing with here, is that these are going to be the same as the outer court gates. And so it says in verse 28, and he brought me to the inner court by the south gate. So think about it. It's almost like you're getting a walkthrough, right? He comes through the east gate, right? Then he's talking about the north gate, right? He's talking about the outer court in general, so you're in the outer court. Then he goes to the north gate, then he brings him down to the south gate, and then he's like, all right, we're going to come up through the south gate of the inner court. So it's literally like you were walking with Ezekiel into this. And so I think sometimes we forget that he's actually seeing this vision and God's, taking him and showing him this. And so verse 28 there says, he brought me to the inner court by the south gate, and he measured the south gate according to these measures, and the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and the arches thereof round about. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits broad. Same exact dimensions, right? It says, and the arches round about were 5 and 20 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad. So now we get the dimensions of the arches themselves. Now, the arches obviously could be the arch between like the 25 cubits that's going that direction, but it says arches. So either you have an arch in the front and an arch in the back, right? So if you think about it, like there's an arch that's right here and there's an arch right here, but you could also have the fact that you have two arches that are going here, because 25 and 25 is 50, and two arches that are going this direction. That's basically giving you structural stability on the top of all these columns. As a structural engineer, it bothers me if they don't have those arches in those directions, but I don't know. Maybe there's chambers there and they have stability, and because there's a roof on all those chambers too. So, but that being said, is that you have these arches that clearly are on between these columns. Now, it mentions that all these arches are on the outer court, and aren't all of these, we'll see that later here, it'll say that, is that the arches are toward the outer court, which means that all these gates are in the outer court technically, which makes sense. And so, anyway, keep reading there. It says, in verse 30, it says, and the arches round about were 5 and 20 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad. And I think that's just talking about the thickness of these things, so they're obviously really massive. Lost my spot. Okay, verse 31, it says, and the arches thereof were toward the outer court. Now, utter, we'll see, is not talking about cows here. We're talking about outer. It's just another way of saying outer. It says, and palm trees were upon the post thereof, and the going up to it had 8 steps. So now we see 7 steps into the outer court, 8 steps into the inner court. And he brought me into the inner court toward the east, and he measured the gate according to these measures. And the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof were according to these measures. And there were windows therein, and the arches thereof round about. It was 5 cubits long, and 50 cubits long, and 5 and 20 cubits broad. Same dimensions, right? It says, and the arches thereof were toward the outward court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And he brought me to the north gate, and measured it according to these measures, the little chambers thereof, the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, and the windows to it round about. The length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits, and the posts thereof were toward the utter court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. So you say, why does it just say they're all the same? I think that the reason, when you see the Bible just repeating the same thing over and over again ad nauseum, I think it's really just to nail in that this is the way it is, right? You see this with, I think, in Numbers chapter 7. Read Numbers chapter 7, not right now, but read Numbers chapter 7 when it's talking about all these sacrifices that each tribe has to do and like everything they're offering. And it's just like this long list for each tribe, and it says it 12 times for each tribe, right? Then you're just like, why doesn't it just say that and say each tribe did that, right? No, it's like the tribe of Reuben, and it's just like, all these things. And then it's like the tribe of Levi, all these things. And it just goes down the line. And I don't believe anything in the Bible was incidental, meaning like I don't believe that that's just on accident. I think there's a reason why God is showing this 3 times and showing us it's the same thing 3 times. Okay, so where did I leave off? Verse 37? Verse 38. The chambers and the entries thereof were by the posts of the gates, where they washed the burnt offering. Now, this is where it kind of we get a little more information. On the north gate, there are these tables that are there where they kill their offerings. And so there's some kind of interesting information about what's going on here. And this also shows you this clearly is Old Testament stuff. It's either Old Testament stuff as them killing sacrifices, or this represents spiritual sacrifices, of the New Testament. There is no way that this is some millennial thing that people are actually killing animals. It says in verse 39, it says, in the porch of the gate were 2 tables on this side and 2 tables on that side. So remember, in each one of these gates, there's like a porch area. There's like a little threshold or an area where you're walking into it. So there's 2 tables on one side and there's 2 tables on the other side to slay thereon the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. Because what's in the inner court? When you go into the inner court, what's there? The altar. So as you're going through this north gate, this is where you'll see all this. It says, and at the side without, as one goeth to the entry of the north gate. Okay, so you're coming in. I believe there's 2 tables on each side of you. And then you're coming out, there's also a porch, right? Remember there's a threshold on each side? As you're coming in, there's like this threshold, and when you're coming out, there's also this porch or this threshold, and that there's 2 tables on each side there. So there's 8 tables total. It says, verse 40, it says, and at the side without, as one goeth up to the entry of the north gate, were 2 tables, and on the other side, which was at the porch of the gate, were 2 tables. 4 tables were on this side, and 4 tables on that side. By the side of the gate, 8 tables, whereupon they slew their sacrifices. And this is all in the north gate. And listen, all this is there for a reason. Okay, all of this is there for a reason. Right now, I'm just kind of showing you dimensions. I just want you to see what's going on here with this temple. But all of this has significance. It has significance in the Old Testament, but it all pictured what Christ was going to do. All the sacrifices, all the offerings, everything was picturing what Jesus was going to fulfill. And so, why was it happening on the north gate? There's a reason. Why is there not a west gate? There's a reason. Why is the temple situated that way? Why is the entrance into the temple from the east? There's a reason. There's a reason for every single detail that is being mentioned here. And, obviously I'm not getting into all the spiritual aspects of it, but nor do I understand all the spiritual aspects. Let's just be honest. I'm not up here just like I have this fountain of information I'm not sharing with you right now about why there's 7 steps and why there's 8 steps going up to the inner court, right? Why is there one more step going up to the inner court? Or when you add those steps, what does that mean? I'm sure there's a reason. But here's why, this is interesting, is because there is a reason. And it's something that you could study out and maybe see the representation. There's a lot of things dealing with numbers and things like that in the Bible, as far as like the number 12 and the number 14 or the number 40 and number 7, that represent something that could very well be why there was this many steps, why it was this dimension, okay? Lost my spot. 4 tables were, okay, verse 42. It says, and the 4 tables were of hewn stone for the burnt offering, of a cubit and a half long and a cubit and a half broad, and 1 cubit high, whereupon also they laid the instruments therewith they slew the burnt offering and the sacrifice. And within were hooks and hand broad fastened round about, and upon the tables was the flesh of the offering. Okay, so you kind of imagine where you come in, right? You come in, this is how the vision works, right? You come in and you see a lot of detail about this gate right here. Then you come up here to the north gate, same thing, not as much detail, but it's like, yeah, you get it, right? You come down to the south, you see that gate right there. Well, first when you came in here, you notice that there's all these chambers that are around here, but You come down here, then you come up through the south, and you see that gate right there, and then you come over to the east, you see that gate, you come up to the north, you see that gate, and you see that there's these tables that are there as you're coming in to that gate. So now it's going to talk about these chambers for the singers and the priests, and I believe these chambers over here are going to be brought up later as far as like up against the temple and stuff like that. Like I said, I'm not like married to this thing, okay, as far as like this is not my drawing, but I think it does help us, kind of visualize what's going on here. But it says here, there's these chambers, okay. It says, and without the inner gate were the chambers of the singers in the inner court. So when it says without the inner gate, I believe it's meaning like in here, right? So you're in the inner court, and then there's these chambers that are here, okay? This is where it's kind of a little confusing on how it's worded as far as what's going on here. It says, which was at the side of the north gate. So you're at the north gate, you're outside of it, so you're in the inner court, and it says their prospect was toward the south. One at the side of the east gate having the prospect toward the north. Okay, so I believe that there's basically a chamber that's in here. So you imagine there's chambers out here, so it makes sense that there may be a chamber over here. There's a chamber on this north gate, and its prospect is toward the south. So what's prospect mean? It means like your view. Like where's your sight of view? Like you're viewing something, right? So basically, when you're going into the chamber, you're coming out, the view of that chamber outward is south. So it's on the north, but you're looking down on the page there. And then you have this other chamber that's on the east gate, but its prospect is toward the north. So this one's coming down. There's one over here, and it's looking north. Okay? And these chambers, so there's these two chambers, and it says in verse 45 there, and he said unto me, the chamber whose prospect is toward the south, so the one that's up here on the north gate, it says, is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the house. And the chamber whose prospect is toward the north, so that's the one that's over here by the east gate, it says, the keepers of the charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok among the sons of Levi, which come near to the Lord to minister unto him. So this is a specific group of priests, the Zadok. Okay, so, and it says, so he measured the court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, and the altar that was before the house. So here's the altars in the middle of the court. The court is 100 cubits by 100 cubits. Okay? And we'll get into this, but Zadok is brought up in this passage a lot. And you know what's interesting about that is that the word Sadducee, I know we jokingly say because they don't believe in the resurrection, so they're sad, you see. And, it's a cool way to remember it. But it does stem from Zadok. So when you look in the New Testament, who are the high priests? Those of the Sadducees. It actually even says that those of the Sadducees were the high priests. And so when you see Zadok mentioned, and then you look at where this is going when you get into the time of Christ, this makes a lot of sense that this is talking about the children of Israel at that time, and when they were going to go into when Jesus is going to come walking on the earth. I don't think you can get around that this is a physical representation of that. Like I said, not to say that this is actually built the way it was built. I think it's instructions, but don't think that I wouldn't be shocked if they didn't do it the way they should. And then in verse 48 here, so we've gone through the south gate, over to the east gate, over to the north gate. Then we're at the north gate, and there's a chamber there that's in the inner court. And then there's a chamber at the east gate. And then it talks about the court itself with the altar in the middle of it. Then it takes us to the porch of the temple. So we're coming in. So notice how we've come into this area, and we're kind of looking around it, and we're getting closer to the temple. And no marvel after this is the last portion of this chapter, which is the porch of the temple, that chapter 41 is the temple. So I think it's just interesting to think about how, you're weaving through this structure and all that. Verse 48, it says, and he brought me to the porch of the house and measured each post of the porch 5 cubits on this side and 5 cubits on that side. And the breadth of the gate was 3 cubits on this side and 3 cubits on that side. And the length of the porch was 20 cubits. And the breadth, 11 cubits. So obviously the porch is wider than it is depth-wise. It says, and he brought me by the steps whereby they went up to it. And there were pillars by the posts, one on this side and another on that side. And so I know this is a long chapter, so I'm not getting into a lot of detail on all these different things, but hopefully you at least can visualize what's going on here and what you're seeing with this diagram here. And so when you're reading Ezekiel 40 and you're just trying to visualize all this stuff, it can be very daunting if you don't know where you're at when all this stuff is being described and you don't know what it's supposed to look like. And a lot of times what you have to do is you have to look at the bigger dimensions, right? You kind of work your way out in, and you notice, oh, okay, this thing's 500 cubits by 500 cubits, so that's the extent of this thing. So if the inner court's 100 by 100 cubits, that means that it's 500 by 500, 100 by 100, you know what I mean? And then you kind of work your way around how these dimensions work and how it has to be to visualize it. Okay, so, but I think this stuff is fascinating, okay? I know this is not the milk of the word right here. This is strong meat. That's why you come on Wednesday nights, because this is the type of stuff that is where you're really diving deep and really having to think hard about things. And it may not be the most exciting thing, but all Scripture is profitable, and I think this stuff is extremely interesting. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the book of Ezekiel. And thank you for these passages, Lord, that we can see how all these dimensions and all of that, and just to think about it physically, but also to think about all the spiritual applications and just what it foreshadowed with the New Testament and what you were going to do. And Lord, we just love you. Pray also in Jesus Christ's name.